Jack in the Box Rises is the third and most recent entry into writer-director Lawrence Fowler's Jack in the Box series of films. Now, if you're not familiar with this particular series, they're basically low-budget British supernatural slasher films featuring a demonic killer clown that resides within a very cool-looking cursed Jack in the Box. The saga began back in 2019 with The Jack in the Box, where we were introduced to the box as basically being a haunted museum exhibit, where the Jack popped out every now and then and killed random people that got too close. There was some basic lore in this film, but this one really is just a kind of fairly standard low-budget slasher. Then in 2022, we got Jack in the Box Awakening, a film that took some stuff from part 1 and used it to basically reinvent and redefine the whole mythology of the Jack in the Box and the Jack character into, surprisingly, something that had a real kind of heft to it, a real depth and a sense of importance, as well as some really interesting and complex characters. This instalment also laid down very clearly the rules of the series going forwards. You open the box, you feed the Jack 6 victims, and he grants you a wish. A basic plot is worth mentioning that's eerily similar to the plot of David Bruckner's Hellraiser film, which was released 9 months after Jack in the Box 2.
What?
It was also a film that gave us a backstory for the Jack. We learned that the Jack is, or was, once an actual human being, this tragic clown character that had been taken over by a demon that needed to kill in order to keep its hold over its host's human form. Just overall, there was a lot of really interesting lore that was bolted onto that very basic chassis of the first film, totally reinventing the Jack in the Box series in the process, creating something that was actually worth getting invested in. Something that's got all this lore and history, and all of this room for drama. There's so many little threads or ideas that were laid out in this film that suggested things that you could play with in future installments. Jack in the Box 2 was just a sequel that really got me sitting up and taking notice, because it was such a huge step up, such a huge progression in terms of quality from part 1, in that it actually got me invested in and excited for the prospect of more Jack in the Box. So, unfortunately, I'm going to have to open up things by saying that now in 2024, Jack in the Box Rises has come out, and though it is definitely a much stronger film than the original Jack in the Box, it's also a definite step down from part 2. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. So Jack in the Box Rises first off does one thing exactly the same as part 2. It refers to the events in the previous film with basically just a cursory line of dialogue that explains how the box has gone from where it was at the end of the previous chapter to where it needs to be for the current one. But apart from that, is completely standalone in terms of not having any real ongoing story elements, characters, or plot threads from previous films. This time round, our lead character is Raven, who, by the way, keeps up the series' tradition of lead characters with very ropey sounding American accents.
My dad said something about finding Crystal Creek when I got here. I was sent here to find that box and take it back with me.
Who we're introduced to breaking and entering. We learn that she's a thief who's been recruited to steal an important artifact, and she's dispatched to an all-girls boarding school from which she has to retrieve for her boss the missing Jack in the Box, which is rumoured to be hidden within the walls of the school itself. So she goes undercover as a student and meets a bunch of your usual kind of posh schoolgirl types as she hunts about through the school to try and locate the missing box, before eventually, of course, it gets opened up and our boy Jack starts hacking his way through the cast once more. So that is Jack in the Box Rises. Now, I think what's interesting about this particular series of films is how each of the films has got their own very distinct identity. They do not by any means just do the same shit over and over again in your typical kind of formulaic franchise way. Part 1, for example, was a very classical kind of haunted museum exhibit film. Part 2 was much more of a character-based, deal with the devil sort of Hellraiser-inspired effort. Part 3, as it turns out, has decided to play things as a murder mystery. A whodunit in that most British of institutions, the posh girls' boarding school. Someone's opened the box, and though it is of course Jack that's actually killing everybody, he's really just a means to an end. He's a tool or a weapon that's being wielded for a purpose, and we have to figure out, along with the characters, who the one responsible for opening the box is. So it really becomes, who's the murderer? And that's an interesting angle to go with, because it carries on the core idea, again, kind of similar to how the Hellraiser films aren't just about Cenobites turning up and killing people, whereby this particular series of films, or definitely parts 2 and 3 anyway, aren't just films about a killer Jack-in-the-Box. They're films about the human monsters who are driven to open the box to conjure up a demon in order to indulge their desires. And I actually think that's pretty impressive, because it would really be so easy to just do some kind of generic killer clown stuff, or to really play up the basic silliness of the premise. I'm always impressed by just how seriously these films treat their subject matter, where there's nothing that's jokey or daft about the character suddenly coming to the realisation that they're getting fucked over by a demonically possessed Jack-in-the-Box. And I think that's absolutely the way that it should be. Because if you feel the need to clown your own premise with a film like this, then you really shouldn't even be bothering making it. And it's, I think, to Lawrence Fowler's credit, that I do care about these films. I am interested in the lore, and I do think that the Jack himself is just a great-looking horror icon who's always shot unapologetically to just look dramatic and scary. There's no sense of embarrassment about, oh, we're making a killer Jack-in-the-Box film, how ridiculous. Because modern horror has really lost its sense of love for monsters, and the Jack-in-the-Box series really are just some of the most classical, unapologetic modern monster films out there that aren't afraid to just have fun whilst also taking themselves seriously and actually caring about what they're doing. So, there is a lot to love about the approach that the Jack-in-the-Box films take. Unfortunately, the problems with this film are more to do with the actual direction that Jack-in-the-Box 3 takes, and the shortcomings of its execution. Now, the central murder mystery angle of the story is fine, there's no reason why that can't work. The problem is that I'm less won over by the schoolgirl thing, I'm less won over by the fact that all the characters to some extent sort of feel the same. Because having all your characters be a bunch of schoolgirls I think is a problem, because it means that you've got a cast of these younger, largely inexperienced actors with nobody along to actually add any kind of real weight or gravitas to proceedings. And I think that what you end up with is just a bunch of bland poshos that aren't really distinct enough to even just be an assemblage of basic cliches. They're not really given enough room to develop their individual personalities or to do anything interesting to help you differentiate who any of these girls actually are. Which is a problem, because if you're doing a whodunit, you really need a decent cast of at least memorable secondary characters to act as your possible suspects. There's, I think, at best, maybe 2 of these girls that I could actually tell you anything about after having seen this film multiple times, and that means that there's no real tension about who could be the one that's opened the box and unleashed the Jack, because we don't really know enough about who any of these characters are to actually be interested in or care about their motivations. The only one out of this group that actually really stands out, and not just for the fact that she's 30 years old and playing a schoolgirl, is the character of Olivia, who is meant to be your kind of bitchy bad girl, who actually gets not just more screen time and character scenes than all of the other girls combined, but who I think actually gets more screen time than our hero, Raven. But then, whereas she should be the one that just stands out from the group as being the bad girl cliche, which is fine when you're trying to make your characters stand out from each other, she also gets a lot of time devoted to an actually quite sincere relationship she has with this kind of pudding-faced non-entity called Dean. And the problem is that not once do you ever get any sense that there's any kind of a legitimate connection between these two characters. But the worst thing is, even if you did buy that relationship, it doesn't go anywhere. Nothing is done with those characters that pays off the amount of time that's actually gone into establishing their feelings for each other, which is one of several things actually that feels kind of off about the writing of this film. It feels kind of first drafty. There's a lot of things that are set up, these kind of big ideas, like there's a thing about the blood moon that involves this kind of weird sci-fi idea that feels very kind of Doctor Who-y actually, very tooth and claw-y, or the fact that one character seemingly just sets the Jack-in-the-Box to life and brings back another character from the dead almost instantly, that seems to contradict every single bit of the lore that we know, that feel like they really need way more explanation, but which just sort of come and go without making any significant impact on the plot whatsoever. There's ideas that are set up, then instantly forgotten about, to the point where it looks like they're setting up an ending to this film that never ultimately materialises. Maybe it's a case where the end was rewritten late in the game, I really don't know, but it just makes the film feel wonky and asymmetrical, and it barely pays off any of the threads that it establishes. Even Raven's own backstory, her motivation for doing everything in the first place, is really just kind of chucked away and forgotten about. But really, for me, the biggest problem that I've actually got with Jack-in-the-Box Rises, and maybe this is me just being a massive sad nerd about this, it comes down to the fact that Jack-in-the-Box Rises is just another Jack-in-the-Box film. It isn't a sequel to Part 3, and it isn't the third film in a trilogy. It's the third entirely standalone film about this killer Jack-in-the-Box demon. And for me, that's a big missed opportunity. It's a big missed opportunity because Part 2 actually did so much to deepen and redefine and explore the ideas that Part 1 threw up. It added tons to Part 1 whilst also working as a completely self-contained film in its own right. You can watch and enjoy Part 2 without ever having seen Part 1. And the problem is that Part 3 tries to do the same thing again, and it really needed to, just a bare minimum, come up with a few new ideas that actually add to the mythology. Because not only is there not a single line of dialogue, not a single scene or idea in Part 3 that actually adds anything significant to the lore and mythology of the Jack-in-the-Box series in any way, you'll actually enjoy Part 3 less if you haven't seen Part 2 because it actually glosses over some of the best things about the whole Jack-in-the-Box mythology. For example, right, there's no hint of the pathos of the Jack character in this that you get from that flashback in Part 2, where you get to see his human form. Here, he's just some generic killer clown. When he kills people, he's just any old slasher. You wouldn't know from watching Part 3 that in the previous film, Jack doesn't just kill you, he actually feeds on your soul, and he drags his victims into his box to devour them whilst they're still alive, which you can clearly see in Part 2, which to me is way scarier than just he pops up and he kills you. That is something that I feel you should really be playing with way more, the fact that the victims are still alive, and something you wouldn't even think about if you hadn't seen Part 2. So it's just that acknowledging key ideas like that is something that you could easily have included in Part 3 without needing to shoehorn in clumsy exposition, and it would have actually added extra layers to the action. It's just that what it comes down to is that Part 1 felt very generic. Then along came Part 2, and it took all the generic stuff, and it refined it, and it gave everything a reason, created all this cool stuff, added depth to the character, to the way that the Jack operates, even to the way the actual films themselves operate. Suddenly, this wasn't just a slasher film with a ghostly clown demon. It was a film about human monsters being driven to make a pact with a murderous parasitic demon for their own twisted reasons. Suddenly, it just all seemed really, really interesting. And then Part 3 seems like it wants to step back and say, well, no, actually, you were right, this is just a generic killer clown slasher. Which is why, to me, this film feels like a step backwards. Because I feel like when you're making a series of films or a franchise, the trick is to actually give your audience a reason to give a shit about what you're making, to care about this world, to reward the loyalty of fans that are willing to come back for each new chapter of the story that you're telling, to see things build and to grow and to advance from one film to the next. Too many filmmakers are afraid of alienating newcomers, when in reality, you should be thinking, how can we turn that casual audience into an audience of fans? Because if you just want to string together a bunch of standalone films that use the same basic concept, then you'd be as well not really making a franchise at all. And I know all this might sound horribly negative, and honestly, I don't really mean it to at all. Because it's not that I actually feel that negatively towards Jack in the Box Rises, it's just that feeling of I sort of expected more. And though I would say, sadly, that I was disappointed with Part 3, it's disappointment that comes from a place of love. It's a place of wanting to see everything that I loved so much about Jack in the Box Awakening continued over into this new installment. And if anything, I just came away from Jack in the Box Rises realising just how much more I loved Part 2 than I thought, and just what a damn good franchise film, what a damn good installment in an ongoing series of films Awakening actually is.
Yes!
Because Part 3 is a well-shot, reasonably entertaining low-budget little supernatural whodunit slasher, with a great-looking monster that's treated really nice and seriously, and a pretty lightweight cast of bland, forgettable characters. For me, if I had to rate it, it's probably about, I think, a 5.5 out of 10. It's perfectly fine, and I applaud it mainly for just taking the idea seriously and revelling in its own kind of gloomy, gothic atmosphere and in its sparse but sincere attempts to flesh out its own supernatural mythology. It just really needed more depth, better characterization, a better pace, and just most importantly of all, it really needed to pick up and to run with more of those great, interesting ideas from previous installments of the series, because there's so much good shit that this film could have made use of that it just didn't. And I'd hate to think that that was because it was a film that was afraid of alienating people that hadn't seen the previous installments in the series. Because that's no way to build a franchise that people are eventually going to actually care deeply about.